Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this series where I help you understand the Waldorf Pedagogy for the Muslim family. Today we're looking at grade 1. We're going to look at the subjects that are introduced in grade 1, the stories that are used with those subjects, and what stories you could use instead if you want to use this Waldorf Pedagogy for the Muslim family. In grade 1, which is around the age of 7 and the beginning of formal education, your grade 1 student will have a number of subjects that are an introduction to reading, writing, and arithmetic. So the first lesson that you're going to see is form drawing, which actually is a prerequisite for writing and drawing. Form drawing also allows a student to come into their body a little bit more. It helps with hand-eye coordination, and it is one of 2 subject areas that I really think help children really come into their body, help with their coordination, and feel confident within their body. The first one is form drawing, and the other one is eurythmy, which is really specific to Waldorf education. It is a movement form that starts in grade 1, and it does match the development of the child year by year. And so different forms are explored each grade. And in grade 1, a lot of forms are explored that can help the student find their space within the classroom. There's a lot of contraction and expansion exercises, as well as movements that depict the sounds of the letters of the alphabet. Form drawing especially helps a student really bring the will forces to the hand, to the writing, to the drawing. And we're really looking at writing as drawing first. And so we're working with the student to help with these drawing mechanics, really help with the hand-eye coordination and those fine motor skills that are going to be necessary for writing later on, and of course for drawing. For form drawing, I haven't seen too many stories that need to be altered in order to suit the Muslim family. I think a lot of the practices in form drawing are ones that can be used with any student. And if there is an opportunity for a story that's specifically a religious story or something that's cultural, certainly it can be included within the form drawing exercise. But form drawing is really a movement art that is expressed with a writing utensil on paper. So form drawing really traditionally is a drawing form. Now, a lot of times you can do other methods of form drawing in preparation for form drawing, where you can say walk the form out on a field of grass, or you can move the form with your arm, or you can draw the form with your finger, or you can even move the form with your nose as the pointer, and then you can even trace the form with your finger before you actually draw it, and then finally you can actually draw the form with a crayon or a color pencil. Another subject area that you're going to have in grade 1 is the letters of the alphabet. So the stories that you're traditionally going to find in the Waldorf setting for the letters of the alphabet are ones that are used from the Grimm's fairy tales, or from fairy tales in general. And fairy tales are especially used in grade 1 because at that point, children do not have the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, from imagination or pretend and truth and reality. And so using stories that are fairy tales that have a strong fantastical element mean that children are going to accept those stories without a doubt, and they'll be able to get the lessons drawn from those stories. A lot of the stories from fairy tales have strong archetypal characters or themes, strong archetypal themes, and those are really the things that we're trying to teach, or to have stories that have those themes, so that the students are learning those lessons, or at least having those stories be laid down where those lessons can be drawn upon later. And so you're finding really strong themes in the fairy tales. So I chose not to teach the fairy tales. I chose to teach different stories that still had those strong archetypal themes, but were stories that were rooted in our deen, and more importantly, they were stories that were true. It was really important for me to teach truth from a young age, Now, when you're teaching something that is true, you also have the discernment as a parent to teach that truth at an age-appropriate level. So for instance, when a child, and this is a true story, when my child looked up at the moon, it was a full moon, so the moon was full, and it was during the day, and the moon, for the full moon during that day, you could really see the light and dark spots on the moon. And my child was asking, why were there dark spots on the moon and light, and why did the moon look the way it did? And he was 5 at the time. And in wanting to speak the truth, I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity for me to explain how shadows are made and how the creators form these shadows, and the light bounces off the sides and creates these shadows, and that's what we're seeing. So I went through this whole explanation of why, this is a very scientific explanation of why there are shadows and dark spots on the moon, thinking that since he asked the question, he must be ready for the answer. And indeed, he asked the question and he was ready for the answer, and the answer I gave him was not age appropriate. The age appropriate answer at that age is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it that way. And then you say subhanallah, so that the child knows that when you see Allah's creations, the appropriate response is subhanallah, to bring it back to the creator of the created things that you are seeing, because it is always an avenue back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's greatness, His mercy, His creations. So at that point, my answer should have been, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it that way. And that would have been sufficient, because that's all the child needed at that point. So in grade 1, in wanting to teach the truth, I did not want to teach the fairy tales, because those stories are not true. And the themes in those stories are themes that you can find in other stories, but in an elevated form. So when you're looking at themes of right versus wrong, or justice, or beauty, or truth, we're looking at the most superior stories available, and those are from the Quran and the Sunnah. So the stories that I would use in grade 1 are the stories of the previous prophets and of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sirah. So let's begin with the story of Prophet Yunus alayhi salam and the whale. This would be the story that I would use to introduce the letter W. I would tell the story of Prophet Yunus alayhi salam and how he was swallowed by the whale and stayed in the whale for 3 days. And he was in darkness upon darkness upon darkness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him by having the whale release him. And he ended up on a beachy shore underneath a tree that shaded him and provided fruit for him. And the illustration that I would draw on the chalkboard is one of a tremendous whale and the waves on the ocean. And as I drew this illustration, I would make sure that the waves were drawn in a way that you could really see that letter emerge. And even the tail of the whale would have that letter emerge, so that by the time the illustration was done, and I might take a white chalk or a yellow chalk to really accentuate the letter W in the waves and in the whale, so that when the story was over, the lesson would also include the introduction of the letter W, and the W would be in the shape of the waves or the water or the whale, so that the letter itself was in the shape of the object that also contained the sound and the name for that letter. So the sound W in water, in the shape of waves, and or a whale. So you're seeing these words that start with the letter W that sound like that letter. These stories have strong themes of right and wrong, truth and falsehood, good and bad, and what is beautiful. And so these are the stories that I would use to introduce the letters of the alphabet. I have similar stories that I would use to introduce the numbers as well. Typically, you'll see that the numbers are introduced with a knight. A king has sent out his knights to search for the best number, and the knights all return, and each one introduces a number and the qualities of that number. Instead of using the story of a knight and a king and searching for the numbers, I would use the qualities of the numbers based on the stories in which those numbers were present. So for instance, we have the 7 heavens or the 8 gates of Jannah. Now those are both abstract concepts. So I would bring stories to bring imagery to those stories so that there will be a connection for the students. So for instance, in talking about the 8 gates of Jannah, there's one, the gate in which you enter if you did so many acts of charity, for instance. And so the stories that I would tell would be, for instance, the one of the Sahabi, who was so generous that his caravans that came into Medina were so plentiful that as the camels were coming in, it rumbled the ground. The dust was drawn up into the air, and people came out of their homes to see what was happening. And it was that there were hundreds of camels coming into Medina filled with products and things to trade, and that this Sahabi took all of those that entire caravan and donated all of that as charity. And so these would be the stories that I would tell, because in those stories, you're again seeing really strong themes. You're getting lessons. They are part of our Islam. They're part of our deen, and they are the best examples to see these traits come to life. These traits are abstract. Charity is an abstract trait. But when you see the story, hear the story of the Sahabi who was so charitable that he donated all of the merchandise from his caravan that was so plentiful it rumbled the ground and brought dust into the air. That's when you can really see what charity is like. You can see through that story. And so this would be the story that I would use in speaking about the number 8, in looking at the 8 gates of Jannah. So why spend so much time with stories and strong imagery? It's so important for me that my children and my students have the capability to use their imagination to think about these things, because we are calling upon them to think about something that they have not experienced. They have to be called upon to imagine Jannah and Jahannam, to imagine an afterlife. If they have not practiced and really experience what it's like to have that kind of imagination, to really hone your skills in that imagination, there will be a detachment between themselves and what they're actually striving for, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to seek Jannah. And so when we are using these stories, we really want to hone those skills of imagination. We really want to bring those stories to life in a child's mind, so that those images are so strong in a child's mind, so that they can then go on to really imagine Jannah and really be fearful of Jahannam, and really avoid the things that would get them to Jahannam, and really strive for the things that would get them to Jannah, and really strive to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need that strong imagination so that we can imagine what our afterlife will be like. Some of the other subjects that are introduced in grade 1 are nature science and the recorder. History is not brought at this point because history is something that children have not experienced yet. They have not experienced what the past is. For them, time in childhood is eternal. Until they hit the 9-year change, time just spreads out like water on a flat dish. It just keeps going. And so for them, history is brought up much later, like actual historical facts are brought up around 5th grade. Before that, history is brought to them in a very fantastical way, through the fairy tales first, through fables, through the stories of the saints, through Norse mythology, through Greek and Roman mythology and the ancient history. And finally, in grade 5 and 6, we're looking at actual history, when children have really come into their own, they've experienced the past, and now they're ready for that concrete information. After so much fantastical information has been laid down first that really appeals to them. And so in wanting to speak truth to the children at all times, it's really important that you choose these stories that are age appropriate for them, but have strong themes, Islamic lessons for them, so that you're not teaching them something that's going to not be relevant for their development as Muslims, and also likewise not be something that deviates them. And we'll talk about grade 3 and 4 and 5 and the stories that we can use for those grades that are age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, and sound Islamic stories. So for grade 1, the history is really the fairy tales. We're looking at the fairy tales as being those stories of the past. And for us, again, we're going to use our previous prophet stories and the story of creation. Then we're looking at nature sciences. And again, nature sciences are brought through stories because at this point, it's really a matter of observing Allah's creation and having awe and wonder for Allah's creation. We're having reverence for Allah's creation in its observation. So we're bringing nature in its whole form, in its living form. So nature studies is often done outside. We don't want to bring our nature studies dead and dry to the classroom because those items are void of life and they're separate from the actual creation. So we don't want to look at a dead butterfly. We want to be outside observing the butterfly in its life, in its movement. Same with grass and trees and birds and animals. We want to be in the environment where we can observe them. And observing fewer animals in their wild form is going to be more instructive than seeing an animal that is caged in a zoo or in an aquarium. It is certainly a delight that can be associated to it, but the learning really needs to be out in nature when the children are young. You can certainly bring those nature stories into the classroom with illustrations and hands-on projects, but we really want to be seeing that nature outdoors. And our own tradition is that children spent years and years outdoors living life outside. This is so important for their development and for their spiritual development. It's important for their development because they need to be outside, moving around, having fresh air, being in the sunlight, jumping around, moving their bodies. They need a lot of space. And also they need that time in nature with unstructured play so that they can spend time having their own imaginative play, having their own open-ended play, even getting bored a little bit so they can figure out what to do. And most importantly of all, being surrounded by Allah's creations. So much of the Quran draws us back to Allah's creation and says that they are signs for those of us who can understand. They are signs for us to recognize Allah as the creator. They are signs for us to remember Allah and to do our remembrance, our tasbih to Allah. So all that time in nature is extremely valuable, not just for their physical development, for their mental, emotional development, but more importantly, for their spiritual development. In all of my years of homeschooling and education and parenting, the one thing that I know will never be a detriment for children and will always provide so much return on investment was time in nature with open-ended play. Time for children to do their own reflections, time for children to engage in the environment. This isn't time doing sports. This isn't time at a play gym. This isn't even time on a guided nature walk. This is simply time in nature. The last subject area that I want to focus on is music. In grade 1, the recorder is introduced. Now, a lot of Muslims choose not to engage in anything related to music except for the drum. And so if you chose not to do the recorder in grade 1, then you could still have music in the form of the drum and music, of course, in the form of singing. Now, singing is a really big part of Waldorf education from the time the children are young all throughout high school. Singing is included consistently. And so we can bring our own songs to sing based on our own verses, or we can use ones that we think are appropriate for our Muslim family. But singing is a really big part of Waldorf education. Another big part of Waldorf education is beginning lessons with a verse or a morning verse and closing the day with a closing verse. And we have the best dua for opening a session or opening a class, and of course closing a gathering. So in the very least, reciting Surah Fatiha to start the day or to open a class, and reciting Surah Asr to close a class or to close a session is part of our tradition. It is part of our sunnah. So those are the two things that I would highly recommend that you include. And of course, entering the classroom with the right foot, saying Bismillah, and for the teacher to say Bismillah before beginning a lesson, and to introduce any dua that is applicable within the duration of the day. When we break for prayer or for eating, teaching the dua for praying, for making wudu, and for eating. For when you're finished eating, learning all those dua are going to be superior to any of the verses that you would do otherwise in a Waldorf setting. So be sure to include those, because that is probably one of the easiest things to trade out, is that we have the perfect sayings to begin, to end a task, and for any of the other things that are part of our daily life. I hope this was helpful in understanding how you can use the Waldorf pedagogy for the Muslim family and some of the stories you might consider trading out so that you can have stories that are culturally and religiously relevant for the Muslim family. Don't forget to check out this complete series and the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find the links to both in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling using the Waldorf pedagogy for our Muslim family on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.